Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like you to join me in a webinar on practical strategies concerning children and students and anxiety.
Hello, welcome to the 1-hour webinar, Anxiety in Children and Youth. This is a 1-hour version of a full-day workshop that we offer. My name is Sherry Coburn, and I've been a trainer with CTRI for approximately 7 years, and I will be hanging out with you over the next hour to chat a little bit about anxiety in children and youth, talk about a brief overview of anxiety, key areas that we can focus on, and then some practical intervention tools. Again, this is a webinar that is 1 hour in length, but we do offer a full 1 day, and we certainly invite you to come and check that out with us as well. So one of the things I want to kind of start with chatting about is just chatting about sort of anxiety in general. The single most important thing that we kind of want to remember when working with children and youth who are struggling with anxiety is that regulated, motivated, capable, and comforting children who are comfortable do not exhibit high anxiety behavior. Everything else is secondary. We are working with children in a way to assist them in helping them feel more comfortable in their own skin. Oftentimes, when we work with children and youth around their anxiety, we start from a place of needing them to feel better so that the people around them can feel better, so that their behavior and oftentimes those anxiety-driven behaviors that we see lessen. And not because necessarily we're primarily motivated by them being more comfortable, but because oftentimes those anxiety-driven behaviors impact those around them, particularly in their families, their school systems, and in their peer groups. And so first and foremost, it's important for us to remember that children who are comfortable and healthy and motivated often don't exhibit these highly distressing behaviors that tend to impact the environments around them. A key concept that I want to chat about and keep in mind throughout the course of the hour is this kind of concept of the over celebration of comfort and happiness. We live in a culture that tends to over celebrate happiness and comfort. And we often sort of tend to talk with people about, oh, you're uncomfortable? Well, you should go and find more happiness. And oftentimes, even with children, when they are showing signs of distress or emotional discomfort, we tend to begin immediately to coach them on how to get rid of that feeling and how to go seek happiness and comfort away from that feeling. And so we do want to keep in mind that there are 3 steps in terms of emotional mastery, and we tend to often get fixated on 2. The 2 that we tend to get fixated on are, what are you feeling? We talk a lot about emotional identification in terms of what exactly are you feeling, and getting more equipped at helping children identify what exactly is it that they're feeling. Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it fear? Is it discontent? Is it pain? What are you feeling? And then unfortunately, we tend to jump immediately to, okay, how can you get away from that feeling because that feeling is uncomfortable? How can you get more happy? How can you get more content? And what this messaging tends to impose in our children and our youth is that there's only one useful emotion, and that is happiness. And that when you're not feeling happy, you need to go in search of happy. And what this tends to prevent is building one's capacity in children and youth to actually be able to tolerate some of those more distressing emotions, or what we refer to as distress tolerance. The human experience really does require that we are able to manage and tolerate and regulate a diversity of emotions. We need to be able to manage anger. We need to be able to tolerate fear. We need to be able to work through rejection. So we actually do require, if we want to navigate the human experience, to be able to manage a variety of different emotions, not just be constantly in search of happiness. And so when we think about helping children and youth master emotion management, we need to begin to think about that as a 3-step process. First and foremost, what are you feeling? How do I begin to identify the diversity of emotions that exist in children and adolescents, and in humanity in general? Without grief, we wouldn't know what happiness was. Without love, we wouldn't know hate. Without joy, we wouldn't know discontent. So we really do need to be able to identify the diversity of emotions that exist in the human experience and be able to tolerate and manage them in livable ways. And so emotion identification is, of course, a key piece of assisting children and youth in beginning to explore their emotions and how to manage them. But that second piece is, how do I comfort myself in those more difficult emotions and those more challenging feelings? So instead of going in search of happiness, instead of looking to escape the distress that comes with some of those more challenging emotions, rather working with children and youth to build a toolbox around what comforts you when you are in those emotions. And in many cases, that is very different than the strategies that help children and youth shift and transition into those more manageable and pleasurable emotions. And so what brings me comfort in sadness may not bring me comfort in anger. What helps me tolerate anger may not help me tolerate sadness. And so, each one of us sort of begins to explore and adapt some of these toolboxes. So, for example, when I am angry, and there are many things in life where it is reasonable to be angry about something, but what we want to do is help people tolerate that anger in a way that doesn't impact and feel unmanageable to them and the people around them. And so, for example, if I'm angry about something, and oftentimes that anger is very legitimate and I'm entitled to that feeling, but I do need to find ways that I can tolerate that emotion in a safe way. And so I need to move when I'm angry. I need to be up. I need to be moving, whether that's walking, whether that's running, whether that's exercising. I know that when I'm angry, I need to move in order for that emotion to feel tolerable to me. When I'm angry, for example, reading is not helpful to me. So, despite the fact that reading is one of my primary relaxation and self care activities, it actually does not help me in anger. In fact, when I try to read and I'm angry or frustrated about something, it actually makes me more angry and frustrated because I can't concentrate and I lose my focus. And that actually makes anger feel less tolerable for me. And so, what brings me joy and contentment is different than what helps me feel comforted and be able to tolerate things like anger and frustration. And the same goes for grief. In grief, I don't want to move in grief. I don't want to be running or exercising or walking. It doesn't help me tolerate and sit with my grief. For me, I like to be still in grief. I like to connect with other people in grief. I actually even can read in grief. I can focus, and it turns into a little bit of a healthy escape a little bit from the intensity of the grief. And so, what helps me tolerate and manage some of those more difficult and challenging emotions is in many cases different than the strategies that help me shift and transition into those more manageable and pleasurable emotions. And the things that I do that bring me joy and contentment and happiness are not necessarily always in line with the things that help me tolerate those more difficult and challenging emotions. And so, we really do need to begin to think about anxiety management and emotion management in that three-tiered way. What are you feeling? What will help you tolerate and bring you some comfort in this feeling? And then what will help you shift and transition into more manageable and pleasurable emotions after that? We also need to be really, really careful to not pathologize anxiety. Anxiety is a very healthy stress response system. And children and youth are highly activated in that. They are feeling out their world. They are trying to sort things out. They are trying to determine what is safe and unsafe, who is safe and unsafe. So there is much about anxiety that is very, very helpful. And so we don't want to immediately move into this arena where anytime someone's stress response or their anxiety response system is activated, that this is something that we need to get rid of. But rather, it can make a lot more sense to explore, why is this activating? Does it make sense to activate? What is it telling you? Do you need to listen to that? Do you need to problem solve around that? Is it overreacting in this moment? And so it really is just the beginning of a signal to pay attention, and to get people thinking about how to manage that stress response system in a way that will actually be protective in some behaviors and may actually get overreactive in some contexts. Particularly with children and youth, we have to be very mindful that we have to make sure that when we're working with them around their anxiety, that it is in fact anxiety, that it isn't a stress response system that is trying to signal them. We sometimes begin with children around that this is unhelpful anxiety. We certainly would never want to coach children out of or assist children out of their stress response if it was in fact telling them that something or someone around them was unsafe. So it is important to begin from that premise that there may be something unsafe that we need to explore before we try to minimize the stress response. We need to make sure that their surroundings feel safe to them, that the people around them feel safe to them. Though that assessment needs to be done before we immediately start looking at reducing that stress response and reducing that anxiety-based response, because we would not want to miss that it was in fact a signal to pay attention to something that was unsafe or felt dangerous to them. So being mindful of working with anxiety once we've identified that the stress response system is activating, but it is not needed in that way. So exploring with kids, are they feeling safe in their environments? And being able to identify if the stress response system is overreacting and that it's going off and alarming when it's not necessary, or is it actually alarming and going off because there is something that as the adults in their life, we need to be working with them around identifying the things that are in fact feeling unsafe to them. We do know that anxiety shows up in a variety of ways. We know, particularly for children and adolescents, it can show up in behaviors that seem unreasonable to the people around them, but actually make sense within the context of the fight, flight, freeze response. We know that children often and adolescents often describe physical sensations of anxiety, headaches, heart palpitations, nausea, things connected to, again, an overactivated fight, flight, freeze response. We know that many children and youth end up with thoughts that support their anxiety. And we'll chat about that, those sort of all or nothing thinking patterns, those catastrophizing thinking patterns, those worst case scenario thinking patterns. And we also know that anxiety can show up in unmanageable emotional states. Yelling, a lot of crying, a lot of isolating. And so anxiety really can show up in a diversity of different ways in the children and the adolescents that we work with. And we do know that within those behaviors, there's a spectrum of those behaviors. And so things can start just from a sense of tension or just from a sense of angst, and then move into a sense of more apprehension, a sense of more isolating, which then translates into worrisome thoughts and behaviors that indicate that someone is feeling worrisome. And then it can lend itself all the way up into those panic states where we start to see the surgence of panic attacks and things related to panicked behavior in terms of the fight, flight, freeze response. So whether that's acting out physically, whether that's acting out emotionally, whether that's further isolating, whether that's ruminating and worrying consistently, it shows up on a spectrum. And as with any mental illness or mental health struggle, everything exists on a spectrum. There will be times when anxiety is a 2 out of 10. Maybe it's low level nausea. Maybe it's just a couple of thoughts that like to sort of like pop up that you don't particularly enjoy. And maybe it's a 6 out of 10, which is, you're talking yourself into not going to school, or you have a fear or a dread that you're going to be sick. And then it moves into those, again, more panic states. And this can vacillate from minute to minute, day to day. And so when we're working with anxiety, we're really looking for symptom management. We would never want to get to a place where we shut off somebody's stress response, that they literally navigate the world without any kind of stress response. The stress response is valuable. It makes us pause, and often go, does this feel good to me? Does this feel safe to me? And so the goal certainly in working with anxiety in children and youth is to not to shut that response off, but rather to just better differentiate between, is this a needed response system? Is this in fact highlighting and alerting you to danger? Or is it actually misfiring? And it's misfiring so much that it has you thinking and worrying and behaving in ways that have you sort of stuck in the cycle of fight, flight, freeze all of the time, even when there isn't an identified threat that needs to be tended to. And so, what our goal, certainly, as I said, is to not shut off someone's stress response, because too much time in either state is not healthy. We don't want people chronically stressed and chronically activated in their stress response. And we also don't want them to have a non existent stress response where nothing motivates them to take care of themselves, where nothing alerts them that something may not feel right. Both of those states can be extremely problematic if we get stuck in them. And so, again, what we're really focusing on when we're working with children and youth is, does this anxiety make sense based on the circumstance? If it doesn't, how do we quiet the stress response system when it's kind of telling us a lie that we need to be afraid of something, that we need to be worried about something when we really don't? And then how do we better gauge when it's going off and it is actually alerting us to something and it is telling us to be mindful of ourself and our wellness and how we move forward on something. And so again, we want to work with children to differentiate that sort of healthy stress response system and that one that can just get overactivated and dysregulated and keep you in a chronic state. It is normal to feel stressed. It is normal for some to have good days and bad days and be nervous about things. These are all a normal range of emotions. It's just not good when these things become chronic, when we are chronically worrying, when we are chronically in a state of stress, when we are chronically anticipating something bad happening. This is not helpful, because then potentially we also miss opportunities when there is something we want to pay attention to, because we're paying acute attention to everything, even when it doesn't need that level of attention. And so there's many things that lend itself to children and youth and the likelihood or their predisposition to being anxious. There's many sort of building blocks that influence how anxious children will be, how anxious youth will be. And there's lots of things that sort of feed into that equation. There's genes. We know that some children are more sensitive from birth. We actually, when you think about it, we start identifying children's disposition in utero. Ooh, this one's really busy. Oh, this one's really quiet. And then upon birth, we start doing very similar things. Oh, he or she is very sensitive. They get very overstimulated. Oh, they're such an easy baby. Oh, they like to be or need to be held a lot. We actually start identifying very early on the temperament styles of children and how their nervous systems may react to environments, to situations, to humans. And so there's many things that go into sort of the building blocks of anxiety. And so those are predisposing influences. Those are things that are just kind of going to unfold. And then we have precipitating influences, things like early life trauma and stressors, things that actually activate the nervous systems in children and youth and get them almost stuck in a pattern of anxiety. The more activated our stress response is in our early years, the more likely it is to stay stuck on the on switch. And so if children had early life trauma or early life stressors, or anything that we could perceive to be significant and anxiety provoking. Maybe that was just caregivers that weren't capable of meeting needs. Maybe that was early chronic illness early on. Maybe that was a significant loss early on. Things that highly activate our stress response system and our nervous systems early in life can create precipitating influences on whether or not we will sort of get stuck on the on switch. And so, those are the things that sort of build people into a predisposition for more anxiety driven behaviors and states. And so many times children and youth are sort of stuck in that pathway of anxiety, and then the world begins to get interpreted through that pathway. And then we have what we refer to as maintaining influences. So things that actually perpetuate anxiety. And so those are often some thinking patterns, right? So we end up developing as a result of our anxiety, ways of thinking about things, all or nothing, catastrophizing, minimization, magnification, seeing the worst case scenarios and everything. And then that proceeds to maintain what's already stuck in an anxious state. We also know that a lack of social skills or can perpetuate anxiety. We know one of the most positive ways that people regulate their nervous systems is to other people. And so if you lack the social skills or you lack the opportunity to connect and build meaningful social connections, that will in fact activate the nervous system. Social connection is a biological need. And when we can't get it or maintain it, it will in fact activate our nervous systems. And so you see maybe particularly shy children, you see children who are maybe lacking certain social skills as the result of maybe cognitive or neurological development differences, and those tend to also partner with anxiety, because the inability to pull in social connection and give and receive social connection can in fact activate our stress response. We know cultural expectations can also be an influencing factor. Overachievement, perfectionism. We know that the children and youth of today are exposed to so much information that they actually aren't cognitively capable of processing. We know that we're creating environments where perfect is no longer even good enough. We know that there's a level of exposure to things that highlight over the need to overachieve. And so the children and youth of today really are exposed to and have expectations that often supersede their development and cognitive capacity to manage. And so in many cases, we're not imagining sort of this increased level of anxiety in our children and our youth. And rightfully so, they are living a very different life than the generations before them. They are chronically stimulated by electronics. They are chronically exposed via social media and other platforms to information that is beyond their years. We know that neurologically they're chronically being stimulated. We know that we are in many cases over programming kids. We know that we're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on them, even in educational settings. I recently became aware that kids could get, through my work with adolescents, I had an adolescent telling me that she got 105 on a test. And I was like, how do you get 105 on a test? And she was like, oh, they give you bonus questions and then you can get 105. And I was like, wow, so even perfect isn't good enough anymore. Okay. And so we really are sort of creating this culture of perfectionism and exposure and information overload that would absolutely activate the stress response in our children and youth. And we as adults are not particularly doing a good job helping them manage that, because we often, in many cases, leave it to them to manage their own access to electronics. We're not necessarily paying attention to the things they're exposed to on social media. They very rarely have downtime where they are not being stimulated by programming or by electronics. And this will, in fact, get people stuck in that fight, flight, freeze nervous system response. And so part of working with children and youth as helpers is stop pretending that we're surprised about why they have higher levels of anxiety than maybe in the generations before them. They are living a very different life than the generations before them. And so this helps us better understand, why are their nervous systems so activated, and why do they seem in some cases riddled with high levels of anxiety, which also impacts their ability to problem solve and impacts their ability to develop some of those natural cognitive developments around decision making and problem solving. And so there is much to be worried about when we leave children sort of ruminating in high states of anxiety. And so ideally that motivates us as helpers to help figure this out, help figure out how do we begin to create more influence over the overactivation of the stress response system in our children and our youth. And so these are sort of the three areas. The stress response system sort of impacts and activates at three different levels. So we have that sort of survival brain or stress response reaction, which happens in the body, which is that fight, flight, freeze stuff. And so oftentimes if we look at children and youth's behavior through the lens of fight, flight, freeze, it makes a lot more sense, right? High agitation, high irritability, high emotional outbursts, running away. Or the flip side of the fight flight is that freeze response, the desire to isolate, the numbing that seems to happen. Those, when we look at many behaviors that youth who are experiencing anxiety demonstrate, they make a lot of sense when we look at them through the lens of, oh, this is a fight reaction behavior. This is a flight reaction behavior, and this is potentially a freeze reaction behavior. And so we know then the next layer of our stress response system impacts our memory, and it generates feelings. And so it changes the way that we take in and interpret the world when we are stuck in fight, flight, freeze. It activates emotions that tend to match fight, flight, freeze. So high irritability, high angst, high emotional outbursts, or the opposite of that, a lack of emotional affect and just sort of further isolation and further withdrawing from the social world. And then we see it impact the thinking brain, that sort of third tier, which then these patterns get more and more ingrained. So the anxious child is more likely to be the anxious youth without intervention, and the anxious youth is more likely to be the anxious adult without intervention. And the more time spent in an anxiety-driven state, the more difficult it becomes to undo those patterns. And then it begins to change the way that we think. And that's where we start to see that catastrophizing and that all or nothing thinking and all of the layers that come with the thinking brain, the ruminating. And so there are really sort of three areas to begin to build skills in order to move to begin to assist children in better managing their anxiety responses. And so first and foremost, working with kids to turn off the alarm, right? Working with them to reduce the likelihood that their stress response system activates when it's unneeded. Then moving into that emotional brain, generating skills that help children shift their attention away from the anxiety-driven response. We'll chat about what each of these look like in more detail, and then working at that thinking brain level. noticing thought patterns that aggravate anxiety, noticing how to shift thoughts to mitigate anxiety. And so we often sort of start backwards with children and youth. We actually start challenging how they think and trying to talk them out of what they're thinking. And so, they're telling us that they're afraid to go to school, and yet we know that school is a healthy risk to take if it is. This is the other thing. If kids are anxious about going to school and there's no identifiable reason to be anxious, then we need to work on that. If they're anxious to go to school because they're being bullied, then that's a reasonable anxiety response system. So we don't want to turn off the stress response system that is saying, this doesn't feel safe to me, if it is in fact alerting them to an unsafe environment. But if we know that they've got peers at school, the teachers are supportive, there's nothing identifiable happening at school that would warrant the need for their stress response system to activate, that's when we want to be working on the anxiety, right? When the nervous system is activating unnecessarily. But as I had said earlier, it's important to determine that there isn't an environmental thing that needs to be tended to. So if children are living in an unsafe home environment, for example, we don't want to be doing anxiety reduction with them. We want to be doing safety planning with them because their stress response system is actually working properly. If children are chronically anxious, and from what we can identify, they live in a supportive environment, they live with supportive people, they live in a safe environment, then we want to be doing anxiety reduction with them because their stress response system is activating when it's unneeded. And so we often start with kids where we get into this sort of debate dynamic and we think we're being helpful, right? I don't want to go to school, nobody likes me, but we actually know that that's not accurate. That's their anxiety talking. So we begin to say, people like you, you've got 7 friends, blah, 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 so-and-so invited you to their birthday party last week, all this kind of stuff, instead of recognizing that their stress response is going off, it's putting them into fight, flight, freeze. And that is then attaching itself to thoughts. And if we could actually start by quieting the alarm, quieting it, that then we would see a more balanced shift in thinking. So sometimes we start with emotions and thinking when we actually need to start with turning off the alarm. We need to look at strategies that actually quiet the nervous system response, quiet that fight, flight, freeze response. And so turning off the alarm really sort of encapsulates three different arenas. Noticing when your alarm is going off, noticing when that stress response system is activating. What are some of the skills that help us quiet that stress response? Because in many cases, our stress response system goes off with children and youth as well. And if you look around, there isn't necessarily anything life-threatening happening. There isn't a reason why this level of intensity needs to be happening right now. And so we need to be able to build skills that will actually allow children to sort of take notice of, is there anything happening right now that requires that activation? And with children and youth, they often need support. What are the things that are going to support them in quieting that response? And so we want to ultimately turn the volume down on that initial response so that a young person can kind of pause and move into some choice rather than that survival reaction that is generated by fight, flight, freeze. And so what that looks like for children and youth can be different among. Someone might notice that at first they feel kind of nauseated. Someone else might kind of notice that their head feels a little swirly and the world is closing in a little bit. Someone else might notice that their hands get, so it's working with children and youth to notice the early indicators that tell them that their nervous system, their stress response is activating. And then what are some of the tools that we can introduce and the skills that will turn the volume down a bit so that you can engage your thinking brain in determining what to do next. It is very difficult to choose our way out of things when we are in a reactionary state. When we are in our fight, flight, freeze response, we are being driven by impulses. We are being driven by survival. Very little of that, if any of that, is actually cognitive decision making. And so we want children and youth to be able to slow down enough to notice what is happening around them. Does this response really need to be activating right now? And there are definitely things that will further activate that stress response. So early on, if we notice some of those signs, the head swirling, the numbing of the hands, the shortness of breath, if we notice those things early on, we can actually begin to sort of slow the response system down. And one of the quickest ways to slow the fight, flight, freeze response down is through breath, is through deep breathing. And the reason that works is because it engages our rest and relaxation center. So it is the opposite of our fight, flight, freeze response. And one of the quickest ways that we activate it is through great big inhales and great big exhales. And when we are fully activated or getting more activated in our anxious response system, we actually shallow breathe. And the more that we shallow breathe, the more that we facilitate the stress response. And so, as patronizing as it can sound, just breathe. It actually is one of the quickest ways that we slow the stress response down to actually assess whether or not it is in fact needed. And when we shallow breathe, we actually facilitate that response. So we actually push ourselves further into that. And so once we're able to quiet that activated stress response, it allows for an increased likelihood that we will be able to shift our attention. The other thing I just want to touch on before we kind of move into the shifting attention piece, the other quickest way that we regulate the nervous system and children and youth regulate the nervous system is to other regulated individuals. So if the adults around them are anxious about their anxiety, the stress response is often contagious if we're not aware of it. So if I'm around you and I'm highly anxious, there is a strong likelihood that you will catch my anxiety, that I can in fact dysregulate you through my own anxiety. But the same is true in reverse, that just through my regulated presence, so someone who is not activated in their stress response can help regulate someone who is activated in their stress response. And so a quiet, regulated presence, someone who is actually able to keep themselves regulated while someone else is dysregulated, can actually be a very powerful regulator while someone is learning to do that more on their own, to become more self-sufficient. But even well into adulthood, the quickest way that we regulate often our nervous systems is to other people who we feel regulated by. It's that ideally, as we move into adulthood, we can do more of that on our own if we need to. And so we ultimately want to help children's nervous systems get more in a pathway where they spend more time in a regulated, relaxed state than they spend in an anxious stress response state. And so working through breath, working through social connection and social regulation with a compassionate caregiver or helper are both very, very helpful ways to begin to quiet the stress response system, or rather turn down the alarm. And then we want, as we assist children in turning down the alarm, whatever strategies and recipes we come up with for that, thinking about thinking about breathing, thinking about social connection. Then we allow to move into this shifting attention. So now that we've quieted that enough, it doesn't even need to be turned off. Now that we've quieted your stress response system enough that we can invite a bit of that second layer of your brain to the table, what are some ways that we can shift your attention? These are often distraction techniques, and this is often where mindfulness comes in. So now that I've quieted the alarm and I'm able to look around and say, there really isn't anything going on right now that needs this activation, what then can I do to further the quieting of that by staying in the moment? Because obviously, if someone's stress response system goes off and they look around and they're like, nope, this is actually dangerous, we want that stress response system to continue to activate. It is a life-saving system for a reason. But if they quiet it enough, look around and say, no, there isn't really anything in this moment that needs this much angst or this much anxiety, then how can I actually get more invested in the moment? How can I actually spend more time? How can I pause and clue in more acutely to what is around me? So it really is about building the muscle in the brain for children and youth around how to be in the here and the now. So much of anxiety, not the good kind, so much of the unhelpful kind of anxiety is about ruminating about the past or anticipating the future. That in this moment, there isn't really a need for this level of anxiety. And so, how do we build the muscle in the brain that allows us to spend more time in the moment? And that is, in fact, a pattern of behavior and a neurological pathway that needs to be fostered, the ability to just pay attention in the moment. And if you think about some of your own experiences in adulthood that highlight how much we lose track of the moment, right? How many times have you driven to work and you get there and you're like, did I stop at the stop sign? How many times have you gone to get out of the shower and you're like, did I wash my hair? We spend a tremendous amount of time outside of the present moment. And the more time we spend outside of the present moment, the more likely anxiety exists. Because anxiety is about worrying about the past or ruminating about the future. Or vice versa, ruminating about the past and worrying about the future. That oftentimes what is happening for in this moment does not require an activated stress response system. And so there's a variety of ways to begin to explore mindfulness. Sometimes we think of these sort of very detailed ideas of mindfulness that somehow we have to eat, pray, love our way into mindfulness. But there is actually very simple daily strategies that help us practice the ability to stay in the moment. And a lot of that is just things that require our attention, right? It can be something as simple as playing a board game. It's something like checkers or a game of cards or doing a recipe with someone or memorizing a dance or having a dance party or drawing or coloring, things that actually draw our awareness into the moment and make it difficult for the mind to move outside of that. And then as we get more skilled in staying in the moment, we can challenge ourselves a bit more, right? We can challenge kids a bit more to practice, like, how long can you stay in the moment without your mind thinking about something else? And this really is a muscle that we have to work with kids to build. And when you think about the children and the youth of today and how much time they spend outside of their present moment, how much time they spend watching people live rather than living. I think of the YouTubes and the TikToks, and they're watching people live while not actively living. and it's not, this is not demonizing social media. There's something very helpful about that. Everything in moderation has benefits, but we cannot underestimate or minimize how much time is spent outside of the present moment when time is spent doing things where you are reading about someone else's life. You are posting things that already happened. You are spending a tremendous amount of time in the past and in the future, and very little about in this moment. And so, more now than ever, we need to be building that mindfulness capacity in our children and our youth. And one of the things that continues to sort of um, um, be drawn to my attention is the children and youth and stillness and the lack of stillness. And I don't mean stillness in terms of being sedentary, because I think a lot of that is happening, but I mean stillness in terms of like the ability to just be present when not being stimulated. So not being stimulated through sport, not being stimulated through screen time, not being stimulated through gaming, not being stimulated through social media exploration. The ability to actually be comfortable in nothingness. And it's an interesting time when we've landed in a generation where being still, where doing nothing is distressing. And we are seeing more and more of that in our children and our youth, that if we are not, in fact, activating them in some stimulating kind of way, they actually feel distressed, that there needs to be sort of chronic stimulation. And so there's two issues with that, is that being still can then generate anxiety, and being chronically busy generates anxiety. And when I say busy, I don't even necessarily mean busy in terms of movement. I mean busy in terms of neurological stimulation. And so there are, as we think about that shifting attention piece, it's shifting attention to the present moment, spending more time in the moment, spending more time being comfortable in stillness. And those things become strategies, things that maybe once were a little more natural and normally developed are now things that we have to build strategy into. So we've chatted about sort of like turning down that alarm through breath, through social connection. We've talked about shifting attention through mindfulness, shifting attention away from those anxiety-driven thoughts and feelings and physiological reactions. And then we move into that thinking brain, that third layer. And it is important that we do these in order. You have to turn down the alarm before you can talk with kids or youth about what they are thinking. Because how I think in fight, flight, freeze is very different than how I think when I'm not in fight, flight, freeze. And the same goes for youth and children. If I try to engage them in their thinking brain while they are still physiologically activated, or they are still distracted by the responses of their anxiety, I really can't begin to explore the ways that their thinking drives and perpetuates some of the anxiety. And so that third arena that we want to work in is that we want to begin to strengthen flexibility of thinking, right? The ability to notice what you're thinking and how that will either aggravate or how it will mitigate your anxiety responses. Most of us, I think, in adulthood know that we can think ourselves into some pretty angry states. We can think ourselves into some pretty emotional states, but that also means we have the capacity to think our way through those, right? Think our way in a more balanced way through those. Think about a time where you were maybe getting frustrated with someone and you literally built a story around the situation and around that person that actually made you more frustrated. That is the brain's capacity to aggravate emotion. And we know that many of the ways that we think can actually aggravate emotion, and it can actually pull some of those more distressing emotions closer to the surface. And with that comes potentially the activation of the fight, flight, freeze response, which absolutely lends itself to that anxiety driven response. And so some of the thinking patterns that tend to really sort of like to live with and partner with anxiety are those all or nothing thinking patterns, right? And you'll hear this in children and youth. You always do this. Nobody ever does this. This will never happen. These are absolutely thinking patterns that will aggravate our anxiety and minimize our belief that we have influence over our states of being. If I always think something is going to be a certain way, that generates a huge sense of powerlessness. If I believe nobody does this, powerlessness. If I believe this will never change, powerlessness. And so those are, in fact, anxiety aggravating thought patterns. We also know that a tendency to catastrophize in thought patterns makes anxiety worse. If we always are able to go immediately to that worst case scenario, this is going to result in this, and this is the worst case scenario, we know that that's not going to make somebody feel less anxious. If they catastrophize a potential outcome, it's not going to make you feel less anxious. And so what we know is that anxiety pulls us into rigid patterns of thinking, all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, permanent thinking, which is this belief system that nothing will ever change, this will never change, whatever this is. And these are absolutely thought patterns that aggravate anxiety. And so as we quiet the alarm, turn it down, as we bring attention more to the present moment, we can begin to have these conversations about, do you notice that when you think like this, it makes you feel worse? Do you notice that even if you shift that slightly, that it actually makes you feel slightly less worse? This is, again, we are not looking to move someone out of an 8 anxiety to a 2 anxiety. That is not how it works. We're looking to create patterns and pathways and a toolbox that will help people have influence over their anxiety. So maybe they learn tools that bring them from an 8 to a 6, and then a 6 to a 5. And then we help them build tools that help them notice when they're going from a 5 to a 6 so that they can help lower themselves down. This is about influence, helping kids feel more influential of their experiences with anxiety. This is not, you have anxiety and we're going to get rid of it. It's going to be, everybody has it. We want it to feel more manageable. We want it to show up more when it makes sense and less when it doesn't. It's about awareness, flexibility, and influence. And that creates a sense of empowerment in children and youth when they can notice when things are changing, when they have a sense of influence over shifting it in a direction, and when they have some tools that help them move into more manageable states. And so, this is just kind of a great little quote. Don't believe everything you think. Thoughts are just that. And so we really do want to get people realizing that just because you think something doesn't make it true, that you actually do have to think about the way that you think. Just because you think this is never going to change doesn't make that true. Just because you think everybody hates you doesn't make it true. Just because you think something really bad is going to happen to mom or dad doesn't make it true. So thinking something doesn't make it true. But if we can quiet the stress response system so that we can actually look at that thought and actually decide, does this make sense? What's the likelihood of this? Move people into a more balanced and flexible way of thinking. So learning ultimately that we don't have to believe everything that we think, right? That is that can be a difficult concept for adults, never mind children and youth who think, if this is entered into my brain, this must be true. Where our own brains is probably the person who lies the most to us. And so, just because we think something does not make it true. But if we can get ourselves into a more regulated spot, we can actually do a much better job of determining, is there any truth to this? How much truth is there to this? Is this as drastic and as dramatic as I think it is? That's very difficult to do when you're in fight, flight, freeze. And so we begin to work with people around being an observer to their life, being an observer to how anxiety shows up for them, right? And so getting people to really sort of get to know and observe their anxiety. And so, asking like, what does your anxiety tell you? What are some of the key messages that show up? So this is again building that capacity to think about what you're thinking about, and then being able to actually determine, does this make sense, or is this actually just my anxiety trying to further aggravate my stress response? Um, you know, Listening to anxiety's message, is it telling you anything that is helpful? Is it actually in this moment just being sort of epically unhelpful? What do you notice when this starts to happen? It's literally getting people out of the swimming pool of anxiety where you can feel like you're being overwhelmed, and getting people up in the lifeguard chair and getting them to look at the ways that anxiety shows up for them. What do you notice about your behavior? What do you notice about your physical sensations? What do you notice about what you're thinking? Because anytime that we can get in at any one of those levels, right? Noticing sooner, being able to become more grounded more quickly, being able to notice when our thoughts are aggravating our stress response system for not a helpful reason. These things all become very, very helpful in becoming an observer to your anxiety. One of the things I found very helpful, particularly with children, but also sometimes into adolescence and sometimes even into adulthood, is teaching people how to worry. That there is actually some value in worrying. Worrying can actually alert us to things that we need to pay attention to. It can remind us that we need to get stuff done. But oftentimes, what happens is people don't worry well. And so instead of worrying, they're really just ruminating, right? That worry can be productive. Worry can be like, okay, you're worried about that, go take care of it. Oh, you're worried about that, you need to get that done. So worrying well is actually a skill. So one of the things I often do with kids is I get them to write down all the things they worry about, right? They worry about who they're going to invite to their birthday based on who's their best friend right now. They worry about, something happening to mom and dad. They worry about the aliens that live in their closet. They worry about, lots of things. And so we create a worry box or a worry calendar. I like the worry calendar personally. And we prioritize their worry. So I don't spend any time talking about whether or not it's worth worrying about, not worth worrying about. I don't get into that debate dynamic. I don't try to talk them out of any of their worries or anything like that. We create a worry calendar. And so, if they tell me that they're worried about who they're going to invite to their birthday party because currently they're best friends with so-and-so and so-and-so, and that would mean that mom said they can only invite 3 people and they want to invite 4, then I'm like, okay, when's your birthday? And they're like, December. I'm like, okay, well, we're in March. Let's put that. When do you normally send out your invitations? November. Okay, I'm going to put that on the worry calendar for November 1st. We're going to get that figured out. We're going to figure out who you're going to invite, how you're going to navigate this whole 3-person when you want 4-person. We're going to figure all that out together, but we're going to put that in November. So we're going to shelve that worry until November 1st. What else are you worried about? Okay, you're worried about something happening to mom and dad on their way to work. Okay, do you want to work on that now, or do you want to work on that in February? Because we definitely want to work on that, but let's work on it. And we begin to actually calendar their worry so that they learn that you can prioritize worry and you don't always have to be worried about everything all of the time. And you can, in fact, compartmentalize worry. And then we start to set goals around the current worry. Okay, what happens for you when you worry about that? When are the times that you're most likely to worry about that? What are some of the things that you've noticed that distract you from worrying about that? And we begin to set goals around their worries. So instead of moving into this, oh, don't worry about that. You don't need to feel that way. That's silly. Nothing's ever going to happen like that. Well, you actually teach children and adolescents how to worry well. And that gives them, again, a sense of influence over worrying, right? That I may not be in control of all these things that I'm worried about, but I do have some influence over how I approach them. And anytime we can promote a sense of empowerment, we reduce a sense of powerlessness, which is ultimately what happens when our fight, flight, freeze goes off. So the two are very much linked. And this is where we begin to just sort of create a thinking plan together. And why are we able to do this in step 3? Because we've turned down the alarm enough. We've brought the attention to the present, which means that we can, in fact, tap into the thinking mind. You cannot tap into the thinking mind when people are totally activated in their fight, flight, freeze. I think we've all been around kids who are clearly activated in their fight, flight, freeze. We've all been around adolescents that are activated in their fight, flight, freeze. They're not rational, right? That's not because they're irrational. It's because physiologically in fight, flight, freeze, you don't engage your thinking brain. You engage your survival brain. So whatever makes sense to you to survive is the best you can do in that moment. And so we really do need to time those thinking strategies well. And they need to happen after we've worked with turning down the alarm, bringing the attention to the present moment. Now let's talk about this. Being mindful not to start with, let's talk about this when somebody's fully activated in fight, flight, freeze. So this is just getting us thinking about. What I want to finish with is this idea of one of the quickest ways, as I've said multiple times, that we regulate our nervous systems and quiet an overactivated nervous system is to other people. And we sometimes also underestimate the key things that activate our nervous system that we do in fact have a fair bit of influence over. We have to be mindful, particularly with children and adolescents. Are they hydrating well? Are they nourishing well? Are they socially connected to regulated people? And are they sleeping well? Dehydration, malnutrition, social isolation, and sleep deprivation are torture tactics for a reason. They fully activate your nervous system. When you are dehydrated, your body activates a stress response. When you are malnourished, it activates a stress response. When you are socially dysregulated or disconnected from people, it activates your nervous system. And when you are sleep deprived, which is the quickest way to change how someone thinks, feels, and behaves in the world, when you are sleep deprived, it activates your nervous system. So these things change the way that we think, feel, behave, and interpret the can generate an anxiety-based stress response. So we need to be mindful that this is the place to turn down the alarm, both for the children and the youth that we work with, who are often struggling in any one of those areas, but also for the people who are working to help regulate them. If, as helpers, we are dehydrated, socially isolated, malnourished, and sleep deprived, we are not being good co-regulators to the children and youth that we work with. So take care of yourself and make sure those basic human needs are getting met, because when they're not, they activate the stress response, which very much can look like anxiety when it's really just someone who needs to be fed, watered, socially connected, or get some good sleep. So we've spent an hour chatting about anxiety in children and youth. I certainly hope that you have found it helpful. I strongly encourage you to visit the website. There's lots of resources on there. As I mentioned, this is an hour of a full day workshop. Would love to see you there. And please don't hesitate to check in with us. We offer multiple ways of training. We have live stream and on-demand workshops. we can come to you. There's blogs and other free resources on the website. Please don't hesitate to visit the website. My name's Sherry, and thanks for hanging out with me for the last hour.